Good afternoon. It is my great pleasure to welcome an old friend and colleague, Professor Raphael Jospe, to this class on Jews and Christians understanding the other. Our topic today is Israel, talking about land, people, state, and that in comparison with the Christian conceptions of community and place. That's not quite our speaker's topic. He was going to be speaking about Israel from the perspectives of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Dr. Raphael Jospe was, until his retirement, a professor of Jewish philosophy at Ariel University, and previously taught at Bar Ilan University and the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He is American-born, as you'll be able to hear. He received his PhD from Brandeis University and has written or edited 22 books and dozens of articles in Hebrew and English. Professor Jospe also served as editor of the Jewish Philosophy Division of the Encyclopedia Judaica, second edition, and his interreligious activities have included lecturing at the Vatican for the Israeli Foreign Ministry and at the World Council of Churches. He and his wife live in Jerusalem. They have 7 children and, until about a month or two from now, 22 grandchildren and only 1 great-grandchild. That also about to change. Dr. Jospe is a lieutenant colonel in the Israeli Defense Forces in the reserves, has wonderful stories about his experiences helping out with medical relief around the world as part of Israel's service to the world. I turn the talk over now to Dr. Jospe, and he will tell me when to share the screen and when to change the slides.
Okay, let's start with number 1, slide number 1. And first of all, let me say shalom from Jerusalem. And can you put on slide 1?
Yes.
Okay. The name Jerusalem, Yerushalayim, at least supposedly, means the city of peace, but unfortunately, as you know, Jerusalem is anything but a city of peace for most of its history, including today. And it remains the most contentious of issues between Israel and the Arab countries, especially the Palestinians, precisely because it's the most passionate of the issues. Something like 60% of terror in the last 3 decades or so took place in Jerusalem. And the problem is that people tend to think that their claims to Jerusalem have to be exclusive. In other words, if I love Jerusalem, you cannot. But from a logical perspective, that's like saying, if I like strawberry ice cream, you cannot. So it seems to me that one ought to be able to say, I love Jerusalem without saying that you cannot. Now, as a Jew, as an Israeli, as a Zionist, as a resident of Jerusalem for over half my life, as an officer in the army, I maintain 2 positions. And I also maintain that these 2 positions are not mutually incompatible or contradictory. On the surface, you might think that these are contradictory, but I claim that they are in fact not at all incompatible. The first position is that the steeples of the churches, the minarets of the mosques, the sounds of the church bells, and the voice of the muezzin calling the faithful Muslims to prayer, these sounds and sights are for me an integral part of the landscape of Jerusalem and part of what the beauty of Jerusalem, the mosaic that makes Jerusalem such a rich and wonderful place to live. And it's important that these be preserved and that these be encouraged and respected. And in fact, Israeli policy since the unification of the city in the Six-Day War of 1967 has been, in fact, to protect the rights despite the terrible conflict. That's the first position. My second position is that at the same time, the Jewish, Christian, and Islamic claims to Jerusalem are not at all symmetrical, and they can't be equated, because the Christian and Islamic claims are exclusively religious, whereas the Jewish claims to Jerusalem are at the same time both religious and national. For Christians, the holy sites in Bethlehem relating to the birth of Jesus in the Church of the Nativity, and in Jerusalem relating to Jesus' passion, the crucifixion and resurrection, in the Garden of Gethsemane, the Via Dolorosa, the Stations of the Cross, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. These are for Christians vital physical links with the divine, and they are traditional sites of pilgrimage and worship, especially during the Easter season. And they are the sources of much spiritual and artistic inspiration in Christian literature, art, and music. They've motivated pilgrimages from the very earliest Christian centuries, and pious Christians seeking the physical presence of Christ have lived here under extremely difficult conditions, such as to this day, the Copts, that is the Christians of Egypt, and the Ethiopians who live on these little huts on the roof of the Holy Sepulchre under very, very difficult conditions. And this shows their devotion and their desire for the physical presence of Jesus. For Muslims, Jerusalem is El-Quds, the holy, from Beit al-Muqaddas or Beit al-Maqdis, the holy house, namely the temple. It's the third holiest city in Islam after Mecca and Medina. Initially, Muhammad established Jerusalem as a Qibla. Qibla is the direction of prayer, but that was only later changed to Mecca. And of particular importance to the Muslims is what they call Haram al-Sharif, what we call the Temple Mount. Haram al-Sharif means the sacred compound, with Qubbat al-Sakhra, the Dome of the Rock, built in 892, and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, commemorating Muhammad's Isra, his night journey, his miraculous night journey from Mecca to the farthest mosque. We'll be talking about all of these points later on in general. I'm just giving you an overview at the beginning. And for them, this is also then the mark of the place where Muhammad had his ascent to heaven to visit Allah. Now, the claims of the Christians and the Muslims are religious. That is to say, they transcend, in both cases, both Christianity and Islam claim to be universal religions applicable to anybody, regardless of nationality or race or ethnicity. And the significance of Jerusalem for them is exclusively spiritual, not national in character. In both cases, the significance of Jerusalem relates to certain events, miraculous events, very special events in the life, respectively, of Jesus and Muhammad. And therefore, even when Christians and Muslims ruled the country over many centuries, and despite these religious claims to Jerusalem, Jerusalem had religious significance for them, but it was never a national or political center for Christians or for Muslims, as Rome and Constantinople were for Christians, and as Mecca, Damascus, Baghdad, and Cairo were at different times for Muslims. Now, the religious significances of Jerusalem for Christianity and Islam are, of course, legitimate and have to be respected. And as I've already said, that's been Israeli policy since 1967. And that can be fulfilled by ensuring, and not only ensuring, but encouraging freedom of access, worship, and pilgrimage, as Israel has in fact done since 1967. In recent years, with the growth of violence and terror, including especially by young men on the Temple Mount, occasional temporary restrictions of access to Muslims, particularly young male Muslims, who are the ones who tend to be the ones involved in violence, have been restricted, whereas older men and women their access has been unrestricted. But those are military restrictions that are temporary during a time of violence, and as soon as the violence abates, then at that time, of course, the young men also can come in. So these restrictions are purely military, relating to the security situation. They're temporary. As soon as calm prevails, there's no problem, and they in no way imply a lack of recognition of Islamic religious rights. Now, again, in contrast with Christianity and Islam, which both claim to be universal religions transcending nationality, in Judaism, there is no dichotomy of the religious and the national. Now, consider, for example, the book of Ruth, the name of your teacher. When her mother-in-law, Naomi, said to her two daughters-in-law after the death of her sons, their husbands, said that they should go back to their native Moab, across in what's today the kingdom of Jordan, across the Jordan River. Ruth replied, "Wherever you go, I will go. Amech ami velohayich Elohai. Your nation is my nation, and your God is my God." And unless you think that the phrasing of the Bible is totally random and accidental, the order of the words is quite significant. Because had Ruth not identified herself as part of the Jewish nation, then the God of Israel would not have been her God. Amech ami. Your nation is my nation, and then Elohayich Elohai, your God is my God. And so the significance of Jerusalem to Jews is both national and religious. Ever since King David, around the year 1000 before the Common Era, Jerusalem has been the national capital of the Jewish people, and its spiritual and religious significance derives from its being the national capital, again, as we shall see in the course of the discussion. And so for me, there's absolutely no inconsistency between recognizing, respecting, encouraging, indeed cherishing the important and valid Christian and Islamic place in the religious landscape of Jerusalem, while at the same time maintaining that the city should be unified and remain unified as the national capital of the state of Israel and of the Jewish people. Can we go to slide 2, please? Since Christianity accepts the Hebrew Bible, the Jewish scriptures, as its Old Testament, Jerusalem is prominently depicted in Christian literature and in art in themes reminiscent both of the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. So we're starting now with the significance of Jerusalem in Christianity. What you see before you in this slide and in the coming slide, if you could move to the next slide, slide 3, is a hymn by Bernard of Cluny, a 12th century French Catholic Benedictine monk, who wrote hymns praising Jerusalem, combining both Jewish and Christian themes. Urbs Zion Aurea, Jerusalem the Golden, you see here, we're not going to go through the whole text, but you see here a Christian hymn from the 12th century in honor of Jerusalem. Slide 4, please. In the 16th century, we have a similar German hymn. The first one was in Latin. The second one is, this one is in German, a 17th century German hymn included to this day in modern Lutheran hymnals by Johann Maifeld. And there's a melody to it by Melchior Frank, and it is still to this day in number 619 in the Lutheran hymnal. Slide 6, please. Oh, here you see the translation of the German hymn in the Lutheran hymnal. And now we move to slide 7, where you see here how you see here 2 hymns in praise of Jerusalem that are included in an Anglican, or what Americans call Episcopalian hymnal, published in New York in 1881. So you've seen hymns in honor of Jerusalem in Latin from France in the 12th century, in German from Germany in the 17th century, and here in English from the 19th century, representing respectively Catholic, Anglican or Episcopalian, and Lutheran, or vice versa. Catholic, Lutheran, and now Episcopalian traditions. Okay, let's move on then now, please. What you now see, you can find this, a replica of this. This is the replica, not the original, in the Cardo, which is the main street of the Roman city of Jerusalem from the 2nd century till about the 5th century or 6th century. And Madaba in Arabic, or Medva in Hebrew, is a city in Transjordan, in what's today the Kingdom of Jordan. It's a Byzantine church. Medva, by the way, is mentioned in the book of Deuteronomy. And the mosaic floor of the church contains a mosaic floor with the map of the Holy Land. And in the middle of it you have, this is just a reproduction of the middle of the map of Hagia Polis Jerusalem, the holy city of Jerusalem. So what you're seeing here is not the whole floor, which is the Holy Land as a whole, but just the city of Jerusalem. And if you look at it, I'd like to point out several features. First of all, what you see in the middle with the columns going from left to right, that means from north to south, that is the Cardo, the main street of Jerusalem in Roman times. This map faces east. Our maps today, of course, face north because we use the compass, which points to the magnetic North Pole. In the absence of compass, most obvious way to take your direction, to orient yourself, is to face the rising sun, which is why in Arabic to this day, when you face the east, then the south is to your right, which is why the farthest Arab state on the very southern end of the Arabian Peninsula is Yemen, from the word for the right hand, yamin, the right hand, Yemen. And to this day in Arabic, the word for north is ashmal, which is the same as the Hebrew smol, meaning left. So left is north and right is south because you're facing east. And we say that our maps today have a northern orientation, but think about what we just said. Orientation. To take your direction means you orient yourself, you face east. Again, in the absence of the magnetic compass, all the classical maps start by facing east. And so we're looking toward the east, and the Cardo then proceeds from the left to the right, from the north to the south. On the left, we see the Damascus Gate, which exists to this day. The current gate is on top of the Roman gate. Then you go all the way down the Cardo, and at the very southern end are the remains of a huge Byzantine church, the Nea Church, which is now basically underneath the parking lot of the Jewish quarter of the old city, but parts of it have been exposed. Now, if you go to the very top of it, as it were, 12 o'clock on the map, what should be there? You should have the Temple Mount there. But you don't see it. You don't see it because there was nothing there at the time. The temple had been destroyed by the Romans in the year 70, and a generation later, in the time of the Bar Kokhba revolt of 132 to 135, everything was plowed under, and so there's nothing there. The Temple Mount didn't exist at that point. But now if you go to the bottom of the center, let's call it 6 o'clock, you see upside down a dome. That is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. But topographically, the Holy Sepulchre should be toward the left. In other words, let's say call it 7 o'clock, something like that, 7, 8 o'clock. Why is it in the center, and why is it so completely oversized and out of proportion? The answer is that this is not representational art, which is supposed to present an actual natural picture. In Christian art at this time, that which is central and that which is large is most important. And so the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, being the most important site for the Christians, has to be central and has to be large and disproportionate in that regard. Okay, so this shows you again the centrality of Jerusalem, Hagia Polis Jerusalem, which you see on the left-hand slide, the holy city Jerusalem. Okay, the next slide, please. We go now to art, and we see here an idealized vision of heavenly Jerusalem from the 9th century, an illuminated manuscript of the book of Revelation, the last book in the New Testament, and the apocalypse described in the book of Revelation. And you see here that the apocalypse is taking place in Jerusalem. Then going to the next slide, we have here from the 15th century, Perugino's Christ handing the keys of the kingdom to Saint Peter. This is in the Sistine Chapel, the Cappella Sistina in the Vatican. But what's particularly of interest is that if you look at the background, you see what is supposed to be the temple. This is supposed to have taken place on the Temple Mount. But the temple is described here, is depicted here as an octagon. Actually, I'm not sure if it would be an octagon here, yes. And why is that? And that is because for some reason, the artist took over the structure of the Islamic Dome of the Rock, which is an octagonal structure with a dome, which has nothing at all to do with the architecture described by Josephus of the temple in ancient times. But you see here how in Christian art, the temple is depicted in the mode of the Islamic Dome of the Rock. Next slide, please. In modern times, Jerusalem remains a theme of Christian poetry and hymns and songs. William Blake wrote this Jerusalem hymn in 1804, theoretically having nothing to do with Jerusalem. It's actually about England. And this song became very, very popular as an almost unofficial British national anthem in the sad days of World War I, when it was put to music by Hubert Parry. But notice the bottom two lines, the final lines of the song, which have nothing to do with Jerusalem. It has to do with England. But notice what it says: "Till we have built Jerusalem in England's green and pleasant land." In other words, the ideal future of your country, of England, is described as Jerusalem, building Jerusalem in England. So we see here some of the importance of the Christian images of Jerusalem in art and in music and in poetry. And we go to the next one, the next slide, which I believe is slide 12. Slide 11, excuse me. This is Gustave Doré's 19th century illustration of the New Jerusalem descending from heaven, again, based on the book of Revelation, chapter 21. And you see here how Jerusalem is coming down from heaven. The heavenly Jerusalem is coming down from heaven and landing on earth in Revelation of John 21, verses 1 and 2. And he says, "And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband." So even through the earliest Christian centuries in the Byzantine period, coming down to modern times, we see that Jerusalem features prominently in Christian poetry, hymns, and art. Okay, the next one then. Some of you may have seen a film called Working Girl that came out in 1988. It's a typical Hollywood film. But the feature music is a song written by and sung by Carly Simon, standing on the Staten Island ferry, and the refrain of the song, it's a very nice song, but the refrain of the song is, "Let the river run, let all the dreamers wake the nation, come the New Jerusalem." So New York is then to be the New Jerusalem. We saw that England was supposed to have the New Jerusalem, and here New York is to have the New Jerusalem. And so in Christian symbolism, we see the complementary themes of redemptive ascent and descent. Jerusalem is the site of Jesus' resurrection and ascent from earth to heaven. And in the apocalypse, the New Jerusalem will descend from heaven to earth. And now we move to Islam. The Quran is divided into chapters, and a chapter in the Quran is known as a surah. Now, Jerusalem is not explicitly named in the Quran, and nevertheless, as I've already said, Jerusalem was the first qibla, the first direction of prayer, later changed by Muhammad to Mecca, and is therefore referred to as Ula al-Qiblatain, the first of the two directions. At the time of the capture of the city in 638 of the Common Era by the Caliph Omar, the Temple Mount was covered with garbage. Omar had the area cleaned, and a temporary mosque was built there, which is why the Dome of the Rock is mistakenly known as the Mosque of Omar. However, the actual Mosque of Omar is next to the Holy Sepulchre, because when Omar captured the city, his followers said that he should go in and take over the Holy Sepulchre. And he said, no, if I pray in the Holy Sepulchre, then it can't be for Christians anymore. It'll only be for Muslims. And so he prayed outside. And at that spot, they then built, next to the Holy Sepulchre, they built the mosque called the Mosque of Umrah to this day. What is on the Temple Mount is the Dome of the Rock, Qubbat as-Sakhra, the Dome of the Rock. Now, why was this built? Now, according to the Islamic Hadith, a tradition of the Prophet, Muhammad in this surah called Al-Isra wal Miraj, the night journey and the ladder of ascent, according to this Hadith, Muhammad traveled on his horse Al-Buraq. Al-Buraq was a flying horse, kind of like the Greek Pegasus, where he led the other prophets in prayer, and then he ascended to heaven and spoke with God, who gave him instructions to take back to the faithful regarding the details of prayer. Next, please. And here is what the surah says. Exalted is he who took his servant, namely Muhammad, by night from the sacred mosque, Masjid al-Haram, that's the Kaaba in Mecca, to the farthest mosque, Masjid al-Aqsa, the farthest mosque, whose surroundings we have blessed. Now, it doesn't say Jerusalem, but I suppose that at that point of the conquest, Jerusalem was the farthest point from Mecca, and so the Temple Mount was then associated with Al-Aqsa. Let's continue, please. And here you see the Al-Aqsa Mosque at the southern end of the Temple Mount, and they call this Al-Aqsa. Now, again, the term, the farthest mosque, appears in the surah about Muhammad's night journey. But this is called Al-Aqsa, and of course they believe that this is then the actual place. And you're looking more or less southward, because from Jerusalem you would face the Qibla is toward Mecca, which is to the south. And this is actually what is known in Arabic as Masjidul Jama'. In other words, a Friday mosque, a mosque of gathering. So this is actually where the Muslims come to pray on Friday, which is their sacred day. Next slide, please. But here you see different views of the Dome of the Rock, which is in the center of the Temple Mount, which is actually, underneath this is actually the bedrock, the peak of the mountain that we will be discussing very shortly. And this was initially completed by the Umayyad Caliph from Damascus, Abd al-Malik. The Umayyads were a dynasty based in Damascus, in Syria. And so this building was completed about 800 years before Columbus set forth to America. Now, it's octagonal. And then one of the questions that is asked today is, why was this built? And why was it built in this form? Can we go to the next slide, please? Here you see a closer view of it, taken from the Mount of Olives. Behind it, by the way, just doing a digression for a moment, behind it, you see two dark domes. That's the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Now, this is a telescopic shot, so it makes it look closer. And then to the left of the dark domes, of the two dark domes of the Holy Sepulchre, is the tower of the Eliezer Kirche, the Church of the Redeemer, which we'll talk about shortly. And then you see outside the city walls, the tall buildings in what's called West Jerusalem, in other words, outside the city walls in the Jewish areas of Jerusalem. Now, why then was this strange building built over the rock, which is the peak of the mountain where the temple stood? This is actually where the temple stood, on this spot. As you may know, in Islam, there are 5 basic principles of the religion, one of which is that every Muslim has to make the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, at least once in his lifetime or her lifetime. And in the Hajj, you go around, you circumambulate, you walk around the sacred rock of the Kaaba in Mecca. So one of the theories is that this Umayyad Caliph in Syria, in Damascus, was a rival of whoever it was that was controlling Mecca at the time. And so he built the Dome of the Rock as a counter, as an opposing site of pilgrimage to keep people from going to Mecca, which was in the hands of his rival. And so you have an octagonal building where you can walk around the rock as you would walk around the Kaaba. That's the one theory. The other theory is that with the Muslim conquest of the city, you had the Holy Sepulchre, and they wanted something to show the superiority of Islam by building something even more magnificent and impressive. So those are the two theories, and I have no opinion as to which of those theories, if either one of them is correct, or what his actual reasons were for building them. Next slide, please. The building, this is a picture from the inside of the dome looking down, and you actually see here the bedrock of the top of the mountain, the peak of the mountain, and this is what the temple stood over. And there's a place here on the rock where, according to Muslim tradition, you can see the footprint of Muhammad as he ascended to visit Allah in heaven. Okay, next, please. Now, today, you will find that many Muslims, many Arabs, will say, oh, the temple of the Jews never stood there. It's all fake news. However, if you look at this was published by a Muslim authority. And first of all, the name of Jerusalem, Al-Quds, the holy, comes from Bet al-Maqdis, the temple, the holy house, in Hebrew, Bet HaMikdash. And as you can see here, excuse me, as you can see here, that in the reasons why this is so important, it says explicitly that this is where the temple stood. And go down then, please, one more. And it continues then, and it says most religious Jews regard entry to the Al-Aqsa compound, which they call the Temple Mount, as a violation of Jewish law. Okay, in any event, they refer here then to that the temple stood, excuse me, and that they also then refer here to its significance for Jesus, who visited the temple. Okay, we go to the next slide. This is a guide to Haram al-Sharif, the sacred compound, what the Jews call the Temple Mount. And this was published, I have this book, it was published by the Supreme Muslim Council in Jerusalem in 1929. You see here the cover, and you see here an illustration inside. I don't have the original, I have a Xerox copy of it. So you see here the cover, and I emphasize this is published by the Supreme Muslim Council in 1929. This is almost 20 years. It's 19 years before Israel became independent. And go to the next, please. Because the pages are faded, I simply copied what's on page 4 and on page 16. And you have here explicit Muslim recognition that it says that the identity of the Temple Mount with the site of Solomon's temple is beyond dispute. And again, in the second one on page 16, beneath the Al-Aqsa Mosque is a subterranean chamber, and excuse me, and again, it refers here then to the Arab construction of the Al-Aqsa Mosque being over the ancient Jewish construction and structures. So you have here explicit Muslim recognition that Haram al-Sharif is the site of the Jewish temple. But that is denied, unfortunately, by politicians today, Arafat, for example, in his day, and following the political line, then some of the main religious leaders who have to toe the political line, who said, oh no, the Jewish temple never existed here, it was always a Muslim site, and so forth. But it's unfortunate because by saying that, they're denying their own tradition, because their own tradition is that Jerusalem is called El-Quds because that was the location of the temple. So by denying the Jewish claims, they're essentially denying some of their own tradition as well for unfortunate political reasons. Okay, And now, excuse me, to summarize, what we've said up to this point, Jerusalem plays a very important role in both Christianity and Islam. And in both cases, the significance is spiritual, relating to events respectively, traditionally believed to have been experienced by Jesus and by Muhammad, respectively. So the claims then are significant, they're important. There's no reason not to respect them, of course. They have to be respected. But in both cases, they relate to events in the life, respectively for Christians, of Jesus, for Muslims in the life of Muhammad at these various points. Now we come to Judaism. Next one, please. In order to understand the significance of Jerusalem, we have to understand something about the geography of the land. You have here a map of the land, and Jerusalem is, you see the Dead Sea there in the bottom, and Jerusalem is just to the right of the H of Judah. Now, when the Hebrew tribes, the Israelite tribes, came into the land at the time of Joshua, Jerusalem was not conquered. It was conquered for a moment by Joshua, but then it remained the city of the Yevusim. The Jebusites were one of the 7 Canaanite nations. And to the south was the large tribe of Judah, with the capital in Hebron. And Hebron is a little bit below a little bit to the south of the A of Judah. You're there. Okay, whereas to the north of Jerusalem were the other tribes, collectively known as Israel. You can go back for a second. You can go back to the previous slide for a second. Thank you. So you have here an area in Jerusalem that was not Jewish or Israelite territory, with the northern tribes to the north of Jerusalem and the southern tribe of Judah to the south of Jerusalem. And in the Bible, you have the description of the borders of Judah. The northern border of Judah skirted around the southern side of Jerusalem, and the southern part of the northern tribes skirted around the north of Jerusalem. And Jerusalem was not Israelite territory, it was Jebusite, the Yevusim. Now, David was the king of the tribe of Judah for 7 years, with the capital in Hebron that we referred to before. But after 7 years, the northern tribes accepted him as their king as well. And so David now had a problem. He had to unite the country, the north and the south. And he had to do that by coming to a new national capital. And the new national capital couldn't be in Hebron because that was the southern capital. He needed something in between, central, and the central capital was not previously Israelite territory. And so what happens then is that he has to conquer Jerusalem, and his conquest of Jerusalem is described in the second book of Samuel, chapter 5, and in the first book of Chronicles, chapter 11. Now, most of us, when we're reading the Bible, kind of go through these lists very quickly without paying much attention. But if you study these lists with the map and you understand the geography and the topography, all of a sudden it becomes much more meaningful. Now, Jerusalem lies on the north-south ridge of the hills that go from the north and the south, which means that the Mount of Olives and the Mount Scopus are the continental divide. And all the water falling on the western side flows down to the Mediterranean. All the water that falls down on the eastern side flows down to the Jordan River, ending in the Dead Sea. So it's the continental divide. Those of you who may be familiar, for example, with in America with the Rocky Mountains know what the continental divide is in a similar way. But it's not just that. The main north-south road in the center of the country going along the peaks of the hills, and the main east-west road going from what would today be the coast with Tel Aviv and so forth, and crossing the country, going down to Jericho and across to Jordan, what was biblical Moab. These main north-south and east-west roads cross each other in Jerusalem. So whoever controlled Jerusalem controlled the center of the country, militarily, commercially, politically, and so forth. So that Jerusalem occupies a very special place. But it also was important because it had no prior association with either the north or the south. And so by conquering it, David was able to establish a new national capital with neither northern nor southern prior associations. This is exactly what George Washington did in proposing the site for the American capital on the banks of the Potomac River between Maryland to the north and Virginia to the south. In both cases, you picked a new site on the border between the north and the south that could unite the north and the south. So what George Washington did is exactly what King David did thousands of years earlier. Let's go to the next one. Okay, what you see here is simply a topographical map of Jerusalem. The gray line that you see shows the outline of the old city walls today. These are the walls built by the Turks in the 1530s by Suleiman the Magnificent, the Turkish Sultan. And they are built on top of the walls, the Roman walls of Aelia Capitolina in the 2nd century. We'll come back to that later. But that's simply there to show you, to give you an orientation as to what we're looking at. What you have on the very far right is the Mount of Olives, and what's not on this map, but to the north of that, up in the right-hand corner, would be Mount Scopus. That's the Continental Divide. Then you come to a major valley, the Kidron Valley. And the valley today is less deep than it was because over the centuries, between wars and erosion and earthquakes, rubble filled up the valley. And so the valleys are much less deep today than they were originally, and the hills were much steeper in those days. And then what you have where it says on the southern end, the city of David, if you look to the right, to the east, you see the Kidron Valley, but to the left of it, you can make out the Central Valley, which Josephus calls the Tyropean, the cheesemaker's valley. And the city of David then was a small area that you see marked the city of David. And as you can see on the east to the right, on the south to the bottom, and on the left to the west, it's surrounded by steep inclines, steep valleys. Now, when you're choosing the site of a city, your two main considerations are, of course, water and defense. But those are opposite principles because water is found in a low place, but defense requires a high place. The only source of fresh water in all of Jerusalem is more or less where you see where it says Kidron Valley, let's say the D of Kidron. There's a cave there in which a spring comes up, the Gihon spring, and that was the only source of fresh water. But the Jebusites had a problem. The Jebusites had a problem, namely they're at the top of the hill where it says the city of David, but the water is down in the valley where it says Kidron Valley. So they dug a shaft, and this has been excavated already in the 19th century, and the excavations have been further explored and expanded in modern times, and you can go through them to this day. Excavations of tunnels going back 3,000 years and more. So when David comes to the city, how do you conquer a city? There are two ways of conquering a city. Well, you can besiege the city, which means you need thousands and thousands of soldiers to surround the city. Remember that the city is pretty small. It's just that ridge that says City of David there. You need thousands and thousands of soldiers to sit there for 2, 3, 4 years while the people inside starve. Or you can use machinery like battering rams and catapults to break down the walls and conquer the city, but that's later technology. David didn't have it. But what he did have was knowledge of, and this is again described in those two places in the Bible that I referred to before, 2nd book of Samuel, chapter 5, and 1st book of Chronicles, chapter 11. And I invite you to read these chapters. David now has an army with him, which specifically includes soldiers from the north. And that's significant. Again, remember, he's uniting the north and the south. And he says, who can climb up the shaft? Who can climb up and reach the shaft? Apparently, since the shaft in various places is more or less vertical, they must have had ladders or ropes or something. The Jebusites must have had ladders or ropes which they pulled up or whatever, and so they thought that it was impregnable. But he and his men found a way to climb up the shaft and take the city from within. Now, what does David do? He makes it a national capital, uniting the south and the north. But to the north, where it says Temple Mount, you see, you still have the valley on the east and on the west. But from the city of David, you have a higher ground is on the Temple Mount. In other words, there's no natural defense to the north, which is why to this day all attacks on Jerusalem always came from the north, because there's natural defense from the east, south, and west, but not from the north in terms of topography. So what he does is the mountain known as the Temple Mount, which was in those days called Mount Zion, and which already in the Bible is associated with Mount Moriah. That is, David then buys the threshing ground. I forget the English term where you thresh grain, the threshing something. What is it, Ruth?
Threshing floor. I had myself muted. Sorry.
Threshing floor. He purchases it. Now, David is the military conqueror. He could just confiscate this land. It's nothing for himself, but he buys it. He purchases it for money. So now the city of David is connected to what is later called the Temple Mount. Not yet, okay, because it's high ground. That's actually the peak of the mountain. And he wants to build a temple there, but he's not allowed to because he was a man of war with a lot of blood on his hands. And so he's told that he cannot build the temple. He bought the site for money, but he's not allowed to build the temple. The temple would be built by his son Solomon, from the word shalom, peace. Okay, so that gives you then the city of David, and then to the north of the Temple Mount where Solomon builds the temple. Then you have the central valley there, and then it goes up to the upper city, which in biblical times is called the Mishneh, the second area, because as the city expanded as the capital of the United Kingdom, it expanded out of the original small area of the city of David. It expanded over westward to the upper area. It's called the upper city because it's actually higher than the Temple Mount, although there's a steep valley separating them. And then in Roman times, it's called the upper city. So in biblical times, it's called the Mishneh, the second area. And in Roman times, the upper city because it's higher. And today it's the Jewish quarter of the old city. Okay. And so that is Jerusalem in biblical, that is the topography of Jerusalem, just to give you an idea of how it works. Let's go please to the next slide. Okay, here you see the city in the time of the Bible. You see the original city of David extended to the north with Mount Moriah, the Temple Mount, and then the Mishneh to the west, the second area, what is later the second area. Now here's the problem. You see that middle wall there, the middle wall. That's the second wall. And the whole question is, well, okay, where did the second wall stand? Because if you look to the, let's say, you see where it says a tomb and a quarry in the upper area there, that is the hill called Golgotha in Aramaic, meaning Hebrew Golgotha, a skull. And that is supposed to be the site of where Jesus was crucified and buried, and according to tradition, resurrected. Now here's the problem. We don't know actually the exact contour of the second wall. And for many centuries, it's been debated because you could not have tombs, you could not bury people within the city walls. The cemeteries had to be outside the city walls. So the topography is clear that that's where the hill is, known as Golgotha. The problem is, was that within or not within the second wall? We can't excavate it because there are buildings, people live there. So if that area of Golgotha is within the second wall, then it cannot have been the site of the burial of Jesus. Whereas if it's outside the second wall, it could in fact be the site of Golgotha. And very recently then, just in the last few years, there have been excavations underneath the German Lutheran Church of the Redeemer, Erlöserkirche, dedicated by Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany in 1898. And the excavations underneath show that there were in fact things there under the ground, under today's ground level, going back 2,000 years to the time of Jesus. So that supports the notion that that area was in fact outside the second wall, thus giving archaeological credence to the traditional site of the Holy Sepulchre. Now we go to the next, please. This shows you Jerusalem at the time of its largest expansion in ancient times. This is done in the times of King Agrippa. This is a few years after the death of Jesus. And you see here the original city of David. You see then the walls of the upper city and so forth. But then you see the third wall goes far to the west and the north into the areas of the neighborhoods today known as Mea Sharim, and where the former American consulate used to stand. And actually outside what was used to be the American consulate in Jerusalem was actually a place where the police stood guarding the consulate, and there was an excavation showing remnants of the third wall. That's in the far north of the picture. And so this is Jerusalem at its maximum in ancient times. Okay. Now we move on. Because of its, slide 26, please. Okay. Because of its very great importance, you have to understand was that the temple was not merely a place of worship. It was the national capital. It was also the national treasury. It was the seat of government. And so the religious significance of Jerusalem derives from its being the national capital, going back to the time of King David. What then happens is that the Jews rebel against the Roman rule some years after the death of Jesus. The crucifixion is usually dated somewhere in the early 30s of the Common Era. From 66 to 70 of the Common Era, there was a rebellion against the Romans. That rebellion was put down by the Romans in a very bloody way, and they destroyed the temple, destroyed parts of Jerusalem, and exiled many of the Jews. That ends Jewish sovereignty and ends a Jewish state for 19 centuries, and no more temple. But already, interestingly, centuries before, on this very same day that the second temple fell, in the year 70, the first temple built by Solomon was destroyed by the Babylonians on the very same day in 586 before the Common Era. And this leads then to Psalm 137. Psalm 137 is written at the time of the Babylonian exile. And if you see here a copy of the Hebrew Psalms with Moses Mendelssohn's a German translation and commentary. And if you go to the next slide, please, you see the Martin Luther translation on the left, before we had the Moses Mendelssohn's translation, but on the right, we have from the Revised Standard Version, by the waters of Babylon we sat and wept when we remembered Zion. On the willows there we hung our lyres, for there our captors required us of songs and our tormentors mirth, saying, Shiru lanu mishir Tzion, sing us of the songs of Zion. Ech nashir et shir Adonai matnecha, but how can we sing the Lord's song in foreign land? Why not? What's the problem? And again, it's possible that in ancient times, people didn't so much believe in monotheism as in monolatry. In other words, it's not that there is only one God, but you can only worship one God, and that's the God of your country. So if you're outside your country, the God doesn't have power there anymore. But it's also quite possible that this simply reflects the yearning for Zion, that the Jews had been removed from Zion, but Zion had not been removed from the Jews. And then it says, in what has become effectively a Jewish kind of pledge of allegiance over the centuries, from verse 5 on, if I forget you, Jerusalem, let my right hand forget. In other words, let my right hand become paralyzed. But it's play on words. It's play on words. If I forget you, let my right hand forget. In other words, forget its strength. Let my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth. Let me become dumb if I do not remember you. If I don't set Jerusalem above my greatest joy, which is why to this day in Jewish wedding ceremonies, the time of one's greatest joy, at the end of the ceremony, it's customary for the bridegroom to recite these verses and to break a glass commemorating the destruction of Jerusalem. So this shows the attachment to Jerusalem, that even when the Jews were removed from Zion, Zion was not removed from the Jewish heart. And we move on. And to this day, the two most sacred occasions of the Jewish year, Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, and the Passover, the Seder, on the first evening of Passover, of Pesach, the ceremony at home, the order of the service at home. Both of these ceremonies, which are really the most sacred times of the whole Jewish year, end with the words, Lashana Haba'ah B'Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem. And those of us who are privileged to live in Israel, we say, Lashana Haba'ah B'Yerushalayim Habnuya, next year in rebuilt Jerusalem. This continues then throughout Jewish history and Jewish literature. And in the 12th century, the Spanish Jewish poet and philosopher Judah Halevi wrote he wrote hundreds of poems, but some of them are what we would call Zionist poetry. And let me just recite for you a few lines because the Hebrew flows so beautifully. Libi b'mizrach v'anuchi b'sof ma'arav, ech et amat asher ochal v'ech ye'erav, echa shalem nedarai v'sarai, od Zion b'chevel Edom v'ani b'chevel Arav. My heart is in the east and I'm in the farthest west. What's the farthest west? He's in Spain. It's the farthest west. But his heart is in the east, in Zion. How can I taste whatever I eat and how can it please? He's not saying he's hungry. He's living in the golden age of Spanish Jewry. The Spanish Jewry in its day, in the Middle Ages, was like, let's say, American Jewry today, a well-off and established Jewish community. He doesn't say he doesn't have food. All he's saying is, when I remember Zion, how can I take any pleasure in my food? How can I fulfill my vows and pledges while Zion is in the territory of Edom and I'm in the chains of Arabia? What does it mean he's in the chains of Arabia? In his day, Spain was governed by the Moors, by the Arabs from North Africa. So it was a Muslim country. And he knew and wrote in Arabic. The poetry is in Hebrew, but his philosophical work is written in Arabic. Zion is in the territory of Edom. Edom became, in ancient times, in biblical times, Edom, which is in the southern part of what is today Jordan, Edom was a kind of a classical enemy of the Jews. And around the time of Jesus, in the time of the rabbis, Edom comes to be a code word for Rome. And of course, Rome then is a code word for the Christian church. So he's in the chains of Arabia, but Zion is part of the territory of Edom. Why? Why is Zion in the territory of Edom, meaning Rome, meaning the church? Because this is the period of the Crusades. It would be easy for me to leave all the goodness of Spain. Notice the goodness of Spain. He's very comfortable. Materially, he's very comfortable in Spain. It'd be easy for me to leave behind all the goodness of Spain, but it would be precious to behold the dust of the destroyed temple. In other words, better the ruins of Zion than all the goodness of Spain. Okay, and now we continue. So this is simply an indication of the centrality of Jerusalem in Jewish life. And by the way, the page on the previous slide, can we go back to it for just a second, please? This is in an edition of Judah Halevi's poems with a German translation and commentary by the late 19th, early 20th century German Jewish philosopher Franz Rosenzweig. Okay. Now, one of the most extreme examples of the centrality of the national and religious and territorial component of Israel and Zion and Jerusalem in Jewish life is paradoxically found in the Babylonian Talmud. This was written by the Jews in Babylonia, that better to live in the land of Israel, even in a city with an idolatrous majority, than outside the land, even in a city with a Jewish majority. In other words, better to live in Nazareth than in Brooklyn, New York. Okay, in the Talmud. Now, and it goes on, whoever lives in the land of Israel resembles one who has God. Whoever lives outside the land resembles one who has no God. And again, paradoxically, this is a statement found in the Babylonian Talmud. The dual name of the Hebrew name Yerushalayim is actually a dual form, gives rise to a tradition that there are two Jerusalems, the heavenly Jerusalem and the earthly Jerusalem. This is the theme that you also find taken over in Christianity. And you see that we saw that in the book of Revelation, and we see it also in Hebrews, where you've come to the Mount Zion and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem. But the difference is that for Jews, it is even if you have a notion of the heavenly Jerusalem, it doesn't negate the importance of the earthly territorial Jerusalem. And that's why the prophet Isaiah and Micah, both in a similar verse, say, it will come to be at the end of days that the mountain of the house of the Lord will be established at the top of the mountains and will be raised above the hills, and all the nations will flow to it. Notice, by the way, it's the highest point, but the nations will flow to it. Of course, naturally you flow down, but here the nations will flow up to Jerusalem. Many peoples will go and say, come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, the house of the God of Jacob. He will teach us of his ways, and we will walk in his paths. Ki mitzion tetzeh Torah udvar Adonai miYerushalayim. For out of Zion will come the Torah and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. Okay, so now let's continue to the next slide, slide 30. At this point, we just have some different views of Jerusalem from the 19th century engravings, and then some aerial views of Jerusalem today. We began this talk with my claim that there's no contradiction, in my view, between recognizing, respecting, indeed cherishing the validity of the Christian and Muslim religious rites in Jerusalem and their integral place in the mosaic of Jerusalem's landscape, while at the same time maintaining the significance of Jerusalem to Christianity and Islam and its significance to Jerusalem are not symmetrical. Because Jerusalem has, as we've seen, religious or spiritual significance in Christianity because of events in the life of Jesus, Islam and the events in the life of Muhammad, but it was never their national political capital as it was for and is for the Jewish people. And we come now to four main conditions. And Ruth, if you can focus on the, I don't know if it's possible to focus on what I've written here. Can you enlarge that? Okay, I just wrote down here what I'm talking about now.
I'm stopping the share, so it's just on you now.
Okay. In all of its history, the land between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River has only 3 times in all of its history fulfilled the following 4 conditions that I've written down here. Number 1, that the land was a separate integral territory. Again, I'm talking about the land, whichever name you want to call it, between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River, that the land was a separate integral territory distinct from the surrounding countries and not just part of a larger empire. Second, that the land was governed by its natives. Third, that the land had a distinctive name of its own. And fourth, that Jerusalem was its national capital. I'm going to repeat those 4 conditions. Number 1, that the land between the Mediterranean to the west and the Jordan River to the east was a separate integral territory, not simply a part of a larger empire. Second, that the land was governed by its natives, not by a foreign empire. Third, that the land had a distinctive name of its own. And fourth, that Jerusalem was its national capital. And these four conditions have only existed three times in all of Jerusalem's history. And that is in the first temple period, roughly from 1000 before the Common Era to 586 when it was destroyed. The second temple period from 586 before the Common Era down to the destruction of the temple by the Romans in the year 70, and in the modern state of Israel since 1948. It is only in these periods that Jerusalem has been the capital of the country. Next, we go back to the slides now. Slide 32. Okay, this is just for your edification to see slides of Jerusalem. At all other times in history, none of these conditions prevailed. Under the Romans and under the Byzantines, the administrative center was Caesarea on the seacoast. The Crusaders briefly established the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem, but at all other times their capital was in Tyre or Acre, and they invested heavily in rebuilding and fortifying Caesarea, as you can see if you visit there. Under Arab and Islamic rule over centuries, Ramla, near where the airport is today, was the provincial capital, part of the Pashalik of Damascus. In other words, it was part of a larger empire with a regional capital in Ramla, not Jerusalem. 33, the next slide. Now, I want to emphasize that I'm discussing history, not contemporary politics. The notion of national self-determination means that a people defines itself, and today there's obviously a Palestinian people who define themselves as such, regardless of what others may think, and with whom the state of Israel has to somehow come to some kind of peaceful agreement, including some kind of agreement regarding the most contentious of all the territorial claims, namely the city of Jerusalem. How that's going to happen and when that's going to happen, I don't know. But in historical terms, there has never, in fact, been a state or a country called Palestine by its natives. Even after the destruction of the temple and Jerusalem by the Romans in the year 70 of the Common Era and the loss of Jewish sovereign statehood, the Romans continued to refer to the country as Judea and to the city as Jerusalem, in other words, Jerusalem. Indeed, Roman coins after they conquered Judah and Jerusalem say, the Roman coins after 70 say Judea Capta, Judah is captive. So they continued to call it by its Jewish name. Palestina then was the Roman name given to the country as part of the deliberate de-Judaizing of the country by the Emperor Hadrian at the time of the failed Bar Kokhba revolt of 132 to 135, the Common Era. And the historians argue whether what happened with the war was as a result of his de-Judaizing the country or vice versa. That is, de-Judaizing the country was a result of the revolt. But whatever it is, the point is he then plows Jerusalem under and rebuilds a city called Aelia Capitolina. Aelia was after his family name, Aelius. Capitolina in honor of Jupiter, the capital, the chief god of the Romans, and he built a temple in honor of Jupiter where the site of the temple had been. And he now decides enough of these Jews. He doesn't want to call the country Judea anymore, so he calls it Palestina, after the ancient Philistines, the ancient enemies of the Jews who lived in the seacoast, who hadn't been around for centuries. So he takes this ancient name of ancient enemies of the Jews who no longer existed, and he calls the country Palestina, from which you get the name Palestine, and he names the city Aelia Capitolina. And the Roman walls of Aelia Capitolina, which were much smaller than the original walls of Jerusalem, are the basis of the Turkish walls from the 1530s of Suleiman the Magnificent, the Turkish Sultan. So the old city walls today are the Turkish walls of the 1530s. Built on top of the bottom layers are the walls of Hadrian's Aelia Capitolina. Palestina was never the native name of the country. In classical Arab literature, the country is usually referred to as Asham, which simply means Syria. In other words, it's simply part of greater Syria. It's not a separate area. The modern Arabic name Philistine in the last 2 centuries simply reflects the European usage of Palestina and was not previously a native name for the country. And so, again, I'm not discussing politics here, but this is simply a historical perspective. Let's go to the next slide. Here you see some aerial views of Jerusalem. In summary and in conclusion, then, Jerusalem is sacred to the three Abrahamic or monotheistic religious traditions, claiming their roots in Abraham. And the religious rights of all three really do, of course, need to be respected and encouraged. But at the same time, Jerusalem has, in all of its history, only been the national capital of a separate territory and an independent state governed by its natives with a name of its own under Jewish rule, which is why Jerusalem has not only religious but national significance for the Jewish people and has come to symbolize their identity as Jews and their hopes and prayers for their national restoration in their homeland. Thank you.